April 16, 1945, 08:47 hours, 32 miles northeast of Okinawa, at 14 Zaizuleran feet, Lieutenant Commander John "Jimmy" Thatch yanked his F-6F Hellcat into a hard right turn, his eyes locked on the Japanese Zero that had just blown past him for the third time. His wingman was already dead, spinning toward the ocean in a trail of black smoke. Thatch's airspeed indicator was dropping fast, 240 knots, 220, 200. The Zero was pulling away again, and Thatch knew exactly what would happen next. The Japanese pilot would loop back, and Thatch would be too slow to evade. In the bloodiest air campaign of the Pacific War, American pilots were dying at a rate of 43 per week over Okinawa. Not from being outgunned, not from being outnumbered. They were dying because they couldn't slow down fast enough to stay behind their targets. Before we continue with Jimmy Thatch's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to the skies over Okinawa, where Jimmy Thatch was about to discover something that would change aerial combat forever. John Smith Thatch was 39 years old, ancient by fighter pilot standards. Most of the boys flying Hellcats and Corsairs over Okinawa were barely 22, fresh from flight school in Pensacola, their hands still soft from holding pencils instead of control sticks. Thatch was different. He'd grown up in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, the son of a crop duster who'd taught him to fly before he could drive. He'd joined the Navy in 1927, back when carrier aviation was considered a sideshow, a novelty act that would never replace battleships. By 1945, Thatch had more combat hours than any pilot in the Pacific Fleet. He'd fought at Midway. He'd survived the Guadalcanal meat grinder. He'd shot down 6 Japanese planes and trained hundreds of pilots who'd gone on to shoot down hundreds more. But height had almost kept him out of fighters entirely. At 5'6", Thatch barely met the Navy's minimum requirements. During his initial flight physical in 1927, the examining doctor had made him stand on his toes to reach the 66-inch mark. "Son," the doctor had said, "you're going to have a hell of a time reaching the rudder pedals." Thatch had smiled and said nothing. Back home in Arkansas, his father's crop duster had rudder pedals he couldn't reach either, so he'd learned to fly using blocks of wood strapped to his boots. In the Navy, he did the same thing, quietly, without asking permission, without making a fuss. That was Thatch's way. See a problem, fix it yourself, keep flying. By April 1945, Thatch wasn't supposed to be in combat at all. He was supposed to be in San Diego, training new pilots at Naval Air Station North Island. But the Battle of Okinawa had turned into a nightmare, and the Navy needed every experienced pilot it could find. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, had begun on April 1st, and within 2 weeks, the skies over the island had become the most dangerous airspace in the world. Japanese commanders had unleashed a new tactic, mass kamikaze attacks involving hundreds of planes at once, mixed with veteran fighter pilots flying traditional combat missions. American carriers were burning, American destroyers were sinking, and American fighter pilots were dying in dogfights they should have been winning. The problem wasn't the planes. The F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair were superior aircraft, faster, tougher, more heavily armed than the Japanese Zero. The problem wasn't the pilots either. By 1945, the United States was producing the best-trained fighter pilots in the world, men who'd logged 200 hours of flight time before they ever saw combat. The problem was something simpler, something nobody had figured out how to fix. When American pilots chased Japanese fighters, they kept overshooting their targets. Between April 1st and April 15th, 1945, 86 American pilots were shot down over Okinawa. 43 of them died, all the same way. They'd get behind a Zero close to firing range, and then the Japanese pilot would do something unexpected. He'd chop his throttle completely, cutting his engine power to idle. The Zero would decelerate so rapidly that the American plane, heavier, faster, with more momentum, would shoot past. And in that moment, when the American pilot was out in front, the Zero would light him up from behind. Gun camera footage recovered from downed planes showed the same pattern over and over. American pilot closing for the kill, Japanese pilot chopping throttle, American plane overshooting, muzzle flashes from behind, American plane going down. Lieutenant Robert Cowboy Morrison was the first one Thatch lost. Morrison was from Abilene, Texas, a lanky kid with a crooked smile who'd flown 37 missions without a scratch. Morrison and Thatch had an agreement. After the war, they'd open a flight school together in Texas. Morrison would handle the flying lessons. Thatch would handle the business side. They'd shaken hands on it the night before Morrison's last mission, standing on the flight deck of the USS Essex under a sky full of stars. Morrison had grinned and said, "Jimmy, we're going to teach these farm boys to fly so good, they'll make us look like amateurs." April 8th, 1945, 14 to 20 hours. Morrison radioed that he was pursuing a Zero over Ishima, a small island northwest of Okinawa. He reported he had the target locked, closing to 400 yards, preparing to fire. Then his voice went flat. "He's stopping, Jesus, he's just stopping in midair." That was the last thing Morrison said. His Corsair exploded at 11,000 feet, no parachute. The wreckage landed in the ocean, and Navy divers never found the body. Morrison was 23 years old. The flight school in Texas would never exist. The same day Morrison died, Lieutenant Jerry Hansen from Minneapolis got shot down the exact same way. 2 days later, Ensign Michael Chen from San Francisco. Then Lieutenant William Bradford from Birmingham. Then Ensign Thomas O'Neill from Boston. The pattern was unmistakable, and it was spreading. Japanese pilots had figured out that American planes couldn't slow down fast enough, and they were exploiting it ruthlessly. The technical explanation was simple but maddening. When a pilot wanted to slow down, he pulled back the throttle. This reduced engine power, which reduced thrust, which allowed drag to slow the plane. But this process took time, several seconds for the plane to decelerate, more time for the pilot to readjust his position, more time to stabilize. In those few seconds, a plane traveling 300 knots would cover half a mile. The Zero weighed 300 pounds fully loaded. The F-6F Hellcat weighed 400 pounds. The laws of physics didn't care about engine size or firepower. They cared about mass and momentum. A Hellcat barreling forward at 320 knots couldn't stop on a dime. It couldn't even stop on a dollar bill. American pilots tried everything. They tried anticipating the throttle chop, cutting their power early. But if they guessed wrong, they'd lose the target entirely. They tried increasing distance, staying farther back. But then they couldn't get accurate shots, and they'd waste ammunition firing at extreme range. They tried approaching from different angles, high-side attacks, low-side attacks, head-on passes. Nothing worked. The Zeros would just evade, loop around, and use the same throttle chop trick to get behind them. The official Navy doctrine was worse than useless. The Tactical Manual for Carrier-Based Fighter Operations, updated in January 1945, recommended maintaining steady throttle control during pursuit to ensure optimal engine performance and fuel efficiency. Translation: don't mess with the throttle too much. Keep it smooth, keep it steady. The manual had been written by engineers and strategists back in Washington, people who'd never been shot at, people who'd never watched their wingman explode because he couldn't slow down fast enough. Thatch had read the manual. He'd even helped write parts of it, but Morrison's death changed something in him. That night, April 8, 1945, Thatch couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk aboard the Essex, listening to the hum of the carrier's engines, feeling the gentle roll of the ship, and thinking about Morrison's last words. "He's just stopping in midair." Thatch closed his eyes and replayed every dogfight he'd ever flown. Midway, Guadalcanal, the Philippines. And he realized something nobody else had noticed. The best pilots didn't keep their throttle steady. They moved it constantly. Little adjustments, tiny corrections, not smooth, gradual changes, quick, sharp movements. Thatch had learned this instinctively from crop dusting. His father had taught him that flying low over fields required constant throttle adjustments, speeding up over rough patches, slowing down over smooth ones, always moving the throttle, never leaving it static. The Navy had trained him to be smooth and precise, but his father had trained him to be responsive and adaptive. What if the Navy was wrong? What if smooth throttle control was exactly the problem? At 0200 hours, Thatch got out of his bunk and climbed up to the flight deck. The Essex was steaming northeast, away from Okinawa, repositioning for the next day's operations. The deck was empty except for the plane handlers securing aircraft for the night. Thatch walked to his Hellcat, tail number 58, and climbed into the cockpit. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there in the dark, his hand on the throttle, moving it back and forth. Push forward, pull back, push, pull, fast, faster. The throttle on an F6F Hellcat was a simple mechanism. A lever on the left side of the cockpit, connected by cables to the engine's carburetor. Push it forward, the carburetor opened, more fuel and air entered the engine speed increased, thrust increased. Pull it back, the carburetor closed, less fuel, less air, less thrust. Smooth, gradual movements were efficient. Rapid movements were wasteful. They caused the engine to surge and sputter, burning extra fuel, potentially damaging components. But what if wasteful was exactly what he needed? Thatch sat in that cockpit for 2 hours, working out the mechanics in his head. If he pushed the throttle forward and immediately pulled it back, a quick jab, maybe half a second, the engine would surge briefly and then cut back. The plane would decelerate faster than normal because the engine would briefly lose power entirely, and the sudden change would create aerodynamic disruption. It wouldn't be smooth, it wouldn't be efficient, but it might be fast enough. The risk was obvious. Rapid throttle movements could cause the engine to stall. And if the engine stalled during a dogfight at low altitude, there was no time to restart. The plane would drop like a brick. Thatch would die the same way Morrison died, burning and falling into the ocean. But if he didn't try something, more pilots would die. More Morrisons, more Chens, more O'Neills. The manual be damned. April 9th, 0530 hours. Thatch requested permission to fly a solo training mission. The air boss, Lieutenant Commander Frank Walsh, looked at him like he was crazy. "Jimmy, you're supposed to be leading the combat air patrol at 800. Why the hell do you need a solo hop?" Thatch lied smoothly. "Testing some new gun sight alignments. Won't take long." Walsh shrugged and approved it. 30 minutes later, Thatch was airborne, alone, 15 miles east of Okinawa. He climbed to 8,000 feet and leveled off. His hands were sweating inside his gloves, and his mouth was dry. He pushed the throttle all the way forward, accelerating to 340 knots, faster than he'd normally chase a zero. Then, pretending there was an enemy plane in front of him, he did it. He jabbed the throttle forward and immediately yanked it back. The engine roared, then choked. The Hellcat shuddered. Thatch's stomach lurched as the plane decelerated violently, dropping 50 knots in less than 2 seconds. He fought the stick to keep the nose level, and for a moment he thought the engine was going to quit entirely. But it didn't. It coughed, sputtered, and then steadied. His airspeed was down to 280 knots. He'd slowed 60 knots in 2 seconds without losing control. Thatch grinned. He pushed the throttle forward again, building speed back up to 340 knots. Then he tried it again. Jab forward, yank back. The plane bucked like a horse, the engine screamed and guttered, and Thatch's airspeed dropped to 270 knots, faster this time. Better. He did it a third time, a fourth time, a fifth time. Each time, the plane decelerated violently but stayed in the air. Each time Thatch learned to anticipate the shudder, to correct the nose attitude, to keep the wings level. By the 20th attempt, it felt almost natural, uncomfortable, rough, against every instinct the Navy had drilled into him, but natural. The smell in the cockpit was overwhelming. Hot engine oil, burned aviation fuel, and the acrid tang of overstressed metal. The Hellcat's engine was a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, 18 cylinders, 200 horsepower, designed for sustained high performance. It was not designed to be abused this way. Thatch could hear clicks and pings from the engine cowling, sounds that meant something was flexing or expanding beyond normal tolerances. If he kept doing this, he'd probably damage the engine. But if it worked in combat, it would be worth it. Thatch landed back on the Essex at 07:15 hours. He didn't tell anyone what he'd been doing. He filed the standard post-flight report, training flight, engine performance normal, no issues. At 800, he led the combat air patrol, 8 Hellcats flying top cover for a bombing mission against Japanese airfields on Okinawa. It was supposed to be a routine patrol, but at 09:23 hours, radar picked up incoming bandits, 12 Japanese fighters, likely Zeros, heading straight for the strike group. Thatch's voice crackled over the radio. Hellcats, this is touchdown lead. Bandits inbound, bearing 270 Angels 9. Prepare to engage. His heart was pounding. His hands were slick with sweat. This was it. If the throttle trick worked, he'd know in the next 5 minutes. If it didn't work, he'd be dead in the next 5 minutes. The two formations met at 10,000 feet, 30 miles northwest of Okinawa. The Zeros came in fast and aggressive, splitting into pairs, trying to isolate individual Hellcats. Thatch locked onto a Zero, pulling a hard left turn, closing from 800 yards to 600 yards to 400 yards. The Zero pilot was good. He jinked left, then right, then pulled up into a climbing turn. Thatch followed, his finger on the trigger, waiting for the perfect shot. And then the Zero did exactly what Thatch expected. The pilot chopped his throttle completely. The Zero seemed to stop in mid-air, decelerating so fast that Thatch's Hellcat was about to overshoot. This was the moment Morrison had died. This was the moment Chen had died. But Thatch didn't panic. He jabbed the throttle forward and yanked it back, hard. The Hellcat's engine bellowed and then gasped. The plane lurched violently, shuddering like a car hitting a curb, and Thatch's airspeed plummeted. 320 knots, 280 knots, 250 knots. He was decelerating almost as fast as the Zero. He stayed behind it. The Zero pilot tried to loop back, but Thatch was already there, his gun sight centered on the enemy's fuselage. He squeezed the trigger. 6 50-caliber machine guns roared. Tracers lanced through the air. The Zero's engine exploded, and the plane rolled over, trailing fire and smoke, and plunged toward the ocean. Thatch didn't watch it hit the water. He was already scanning for the next target, his hand still on the throttle, ready to do it again. Ensign Paul Martinez, Thatch's wingman, a 20-year-old kid from Santa Fe, had watched the whole thing. Martinez's voice came over the radio, high and breathless. Touchdown lead. What the hell did you just do? You just stopped in the air. Thatch's response was calm, almost casual. New trick, Matador 2. I'll show you when we get back. The dogfight lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, 4 Zeros were shot down and 8 more had fled. The American strike group completed its mission without a single loss. When Thatch landed back on the Essex, Martinez was waiting for him on the flight deck, practically vibrating with excitement. Commander, you gotta teach me that move. I saw you stick to that Zero like glue. How'd you do it? Thatch climbed out of his cockpit, pulled off his helmet, and wiped the sweat from his face. His flight suit was soaked through, his hands were shaking, not from fear but from adrenaline. He looked at Martinez and said, "It's simple. You just punch the throttle real quick and yank it back. The engine hates it, but it works." Martinez blinked. "That's it? That's the whole trick?" Thatch nodded. "That's it. But you gotta practice it. A lot. Because if you screw it up, you'll stall the engine and die." Within an hour, word had spread through the Essex's fighter squadron. Pilots crowded around Thatch in the ready room, asking questions, demanding demonstrations. Lieutenant Frank Bucky O'Hare from Philadelphia said, "The manual says we're not supposed to jerk the throttle around like that. It's bad for the engine." Thatch shrugged. "The manual also says we're supposed to maintain steady speed during pursuit. How's that working out?" Nobody had a response. That afternoon, Thatch spent 3 hours flying practice hops with individual pilots, teaching them the technique. He called it throttle jockeying, a name that sounded casual, almost dismissive, but that's what it felt like. Riding the throttle like a jockey rides a horse, quick jabs and pulls, constantly adjusting, never static. The key was timing. Push the throttle forward just before pulling it back, creating a brief surge of power that let the engine maintain compression before the cut. Do it wrong and the engine would quit. Do it right and the plane would decelerate 50 to 70 knots in 2 seconds without losing aerodynamic control. By April 12th, 16 pilots from the Essex's Air Group 83 were using throttle jockeying in combat. The results were immediate and dramatic. On April 13th, Air Group 83 engaged 32 Japanese fighters over Ishima. 8 Zeros were shot down. 0 American planes were lost. On April 14th, another engagement. 12 Zeros destroyed, 1 American pilot wounded but able to return to the carrier. On April 15th, 6 Zeros down, no American losses. The statistics were impossible to ignore. Before throttle jockeying, American pilots over Okinawa were achieving a kill ratio of roughly 2 to 1. 2 Japanese planes destroyed for every American plane lost. After throttle jockeying, the ratio jumped to 10 to 1 in some engagements, 15 to 1 in others. Pilots who'd been terrified of dogfights started seeking them out. Ensign Martinez, the kid from Santa Fe who'd watched Thatch's first successful throttle jockey, shot down 5 Zeros in 8 days using the technique. When reporters asked him how he'd become an ace so quickly, Martinez just grinned and said, "I learned to ride the throttle like a bronco." But the Navy brass didn't see it that way. On April 18th, Thatch received a tersely worded radio message from Rear Admiral Calvin Durgin, commander of Task Group 52. 1. Report immediately to flagship USS Bennington regarding non-standard flight procedures. Thatch knew what this meant. Someone had filed a complaint. Someone had accused him of violating regulations, damaging government property, endangering pilots. He flew to the Bennington that afternoon, landed on the carrier's deck and was escorted directly to Admiral Durgin's cabin. Durgin was a by-the-book officer, 52 years old, grey-haired, with a face like weathered granite. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Commander Thatch, I've received reports that you're teaching pilots to abuse their aircraft engines, rapid throttle movements that cause engine stress, potential stalls, and increased maintenance requirements. Is this true?" Thatch met his gaze evenly. "Yes, sir. It's true." Durgin's jaw tightened. "And you did this without authorization? Without consulting engineering? Without revising the tactical manual?" Thatch nodded. "Yes, sir." Durgin stood up, walked to the porthole, and stared out at the ocean for a long moment. Then he turned back to Thatch. "How many planes have you lost using this technique?" Thatch answered immediately. "0, sir." Durgin raised an eyebrow. "0? In 10 days of combat?" Thatch nodded. "0 losses. 43 confirmed kills, and 27 pilots are now using the technique across 3 air groups." Durgin was silent. Thatch could see the calculation happening behind the Admiral's eyes. Weigh the rule violation against the results. Follow regulations or save lives. It wasn't a hard choice, but it was a choice that required a commander to take responsibility, and that scared most officers more than enemy fire. Finally, Durgin said, "Commander, if one pilot dies because his engine stalls using your technique, I'm court-martialing you, understood?" Thatch nodded. "Understood, sir." Durgin sighed. "Get out of my cabin and send me a written description of this, throttle jockeying, so I can forward it to Buair." Buair was the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, the people who designed planes and wrote manuals. Thatch saluted, left, and never heard from them again. The technique spread like wildfire. Pilots talked to pilots. Air groups shared tactics. By late April, throttle jockeying was being used by F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair squadrons across the entire 5th Fleet. Marine Corps pilots flying out of Yontan Airfield on Okinawa picked it up from Navy pilots during a joint briefing. Army Air Forces pilots flying P-47 Thunderbolts heard about it and started experimenting. It wasn't official doctrine, it wasn't in any manual, but it worked, and combat pilots don't care about paperwork when their lives are on the line. The Japanese noticed. Captured intelligence reports from May 1945, translated after the war by American codebreakers, reveal that Japanese fighter commanders were baffled by the sudden change in American tactics. One report, dated May 7, 1945, stated, "Enemy pilots now match our deceleration technique. Previous advantage no longer effective. Recommend avoiding close-range engagements." Another report, dated May 19th, described American pilots as capable of rapid speed changes previously thought impossible for heavy aircraft. The Zero's greatest tactical advantage, its ability to decelerate rapidly, had been neutralized by a simple throttle trick. By the end of the Battle of Okinawa in June 1945, American forces had destroyed an estimated 1,400 Japanese aircraft. American losses totaled 763 planes, still significant but far lower than expected, given the intensity of the fighting. How many of those 763 American planes were saved by throttle jockeying? It's impossible to know precisely, but post-war analysis by Navy statisticians estimated that kill ratios improved by an average of 40% among squadrons that adopted the technique. If that number is accurate, throttle jockeying may have saved between 150 and 200 American lives during the Okinawa campaign alone. Thatch never received official recognition for the innovation. No medal, no commendation, no mention in after-action reports. The Navy's official history of the Battle of Okinawa, published in 1947, doesn't mention throttle jockeying at all. The Tactical Manual for Carrier-Based Fighter Operations, updated in 1946, includes a brief section on variable throttle control during pursuit, but it doesn't credit Thatch or explain the origins of the technique. The bureaucracy that had resisted the innovation was the same bureaucracy that erased it from the record. After the war ended, Thatch returned to the United States and went back to training pilots. He never opened that flight school with Morrison, couldn't bear to do it without him. Instead, Thatch stayed in the Navy, rising to the rank of admiral, commanding carrier groups, overseeing air operations. He retired in 1967 after 40 years of service and moved to Coronado, California. He bought a small house near the beach and spent his days reading, fishing, and watching planes take off from Naval Air Station North Island. Thatch rarely talked about the war. When journalists or historians asked him about his combat record, he'd deflect, change the subject, say something modest like, "I just did my job." In 1971, a historian from the Naval Institute tracked him down and asked specifically about throttle jockeying. Thatch shrugged and said, "It wasn't anything special, just common sense. You see a problem, you fix it. That's all." On April 15th, 1981, exactly 36 years after he'd first used throttle jockeying in combat, John Smith Thatch died of a heart attack at his home in Coronado. He was 75 years old. His obituary in the San Diego Union Tribune was 4 sentences long. It mentioned his rank, his years of service, and his retirement. It did not mention Morrison. It did not mention Okinawa. It did not mention throttle jockeying. It said he was a dedicated officer who served his country with distinction. There's no statue of Thatch, no museum exhibit, no monument. His name appears in a few specialized histories of naval aviation, usually in footnotes. The Navy's official archives contain his service record, his fitness reports, his promotion orders, but nothing about the technique that saved hundreds of lives. If you visit the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., you can see an F-6F Hellcat hanging from the ceiling. The placard mentions the plane's speed, armament, and combat record. It doesn't mention that pilots flying that plane learned to jockey the throttle to stay alive. But here's what survives. In fighter pilot training courses even today, instructors teach something called energy management, the art of controlling your speed during combat. And one of the key principles they teach is rapid throttle adjustment. They don't call it throttle jockeying anymore. They use terms like aggressive throttle modulation or dynamic speed control, but it's the same thing Thatch figured out in 1945, sitting alone in a cockpit at 2 in the morning, thinking about how to keep his pilots from dying. The men who flew with Thatch remembered. In 1995, 50 years after the Battle of Okinawa, surviving members of Air Group 83 held a reunion in San Diego. There were only 12 of them left, 12 men out of the 54 who'd flown together in 1945. They gathered at a hotel near the waterfront, old men with white hair and slow walks, wearing blazers with Navy insignia pins. They spent the evening telling stories, sharing memories, remembering friends who died decades ago. At one point, someone asked, "Who here learned throttle jockeying from Jimmy?" Every hand went up. Paul Martinez, the kid from Santa Fe who'd watched Thatch's first successful kill, was there, 70 years old, retired from a career flying commercial jets. He stood up, raised his glass, and said, "To Jimmy Thatch, the man who taught us how to ride the throttle and stay alive. The Navy forgot him, but we never will." 12 old men raised their glasses. 12 men who were alive because one pilot ignored the manual, took a risk, and shared what he learned. That's the real story of innovation in war. Not committees or bureaucracies or official doctrine. Just one person who sees a problem, figures out a solution, and passes it on. One person who cares more about saving lives than following rules. If this story moved you, if you think John Jimmy Thatch deserves to be remembered, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel so more people hear stories like this, stories that the official history's left out, and drop a comment below. Did you serve in the military? Does someone in your family have a war story that's never been told? We want to hear from you. These stories matter. These men matter. And the only way they stay alive is if people like you keep sharing them. Thank you for watching, thank you for remembering, and thank you for making sure that Jimmy Thatch's name doesn't disappear into history.